Mr. Clerk, time's 5:48. I call this meeting to order. Town of Aurora acknowledges that the Anishinaabe lands on which we live and work are the traditional and treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, as well as many other nations whose presence here continues to this day. As the closest First Nation community to Aurora, we recognize the special relationship the Chippewas have with the lands and waters of this territory. They are the water protectors and environmental stewards of these lands, and as a municipality, we join them in these responsibilities. Further acknowledge that Aurora is part of the treaty lands of the Mississaugas and Chippewas recognized through Treaty Number 13, as well as the Williams Treaties of 1923. Shared understanding of the rich cultural heritage that has existed for centuries and how our collective past brought us to where we are today will help us walk together into a better future. Council, can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Councilor Gallo, Councilor Weiss, comments, questions? All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. One item we're discussing for this workshop, development charges, and we have a presentation by Gary Scanlon and Brian Tan. Welcome, gentlemen. Come on up. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You can explain about all the money that the provincial government's taken away from us.
It's considerable if you look at some of the other municipalities. So I think I was already mentioning Richmond Hill and Markham and Vaughan all did their calculations. They're north of $500 million. So it is significant. So you're having to come to grips with that. So I'm happy to give you a presentation. I'm happy to give the presentation, whether you're happy to receive the Bill 23 information, that'll be slightly different. So it's a pleasure. We've initiated the study, and as we go through, we'll give you the kind of the steps that we're following, over the next X number of months. So we've engaged. We've already started with staff, and we've already had one meeting with the development group. So I guess I'm in control now. Maybe. Oh, there we go. So the timeline, as I've noted, we've kicked off the process, and we have had a stakeholder group last month. Wasn't extremely attended. I think there was only 3 people attending. The invites went out to many people, but I think we're more interested when they see the actual numbers. So we're hopeful of seeing more engagement as we move through the calculations. So we're hopeful to get the report out in the very early 2024, have the public meeting, and then council can consider the bylaw. That process normally takes a minimum 60 days. So from the time the report's released, the access that you cannot consider the bylaw until at least 60 days have passed. And in between that period, you must have a public meeting to receive any input from the public. Development charges, as you'll see in a minute, they've been around actually since the mid-1950s. So they're older than I am. They were under the Planning Act. If you've ever heard the term lot levy, that was the nickname for them, because under the Planning Act, you could impose a charge when you created a lot, severance or subdivision, and that's how they got the nickname. Since 1989, we've had a Development Charges Act, which has set out the rules and regulations. In essence, they allow you to recover capital costs, which are related to both residential and non-residential development. So there's a number of tests and such. I'll talk on a couple of the things that we go through in the calculations, but basically is to assist in recovering growth-related infrastructure. The second point, the second bullet, is very important, because what it does is it distinguishes in the development charge that there's 2 different types of infrastructure costs. One which is very localized. So let's say within a subdivision, there may be internal roads, water mains, sewers, street lights, sidewalks, that type of thing. Those are coined as local service. So those very localized costs are basically 100% the developer's responsibility. What we put into the development charge is the broader costs, major road infrastructure, major trunks, sewers, parks, recreation facilities, libraries, those type of things. So it distinguishes it, but we have to, within the background study, is to lay out a definition specifically for you what the local service policy is. So that's a very important part, and it is a mandatory requirement as part of the process. As I've noted, development charges been here since mid-1950s, initially under the Planning Act, and you can see there's been a number of changes over the years. In 1989, development charges were, for the most part, 100% recovery. But since 1997, they came in and made significant changes, which municipalities lost about 25% of their growth-related revenues as a result of the changes there. And then you can see just in the last 7 years, there's been considerable changes through Bill 73, which was introduced under the then Liberal government. And since the Conservative government has been into power, you can see they've introduced a number, 6 more changes to the legislation. Number of them, and I'll touch base on most of them, but you can see that at the end of the day, we've lost a considerable amount of additional funds. I'm not getting any response here. Are you able to hit the button for me? It's just not doing it.
Councillor Thompson, I'm going to pass the chair to you quickly. Okay. I'll be right back.
Go back one more. Okay, so that's what. Sorry about that. So just to recap some of the more recent changes, you can see that Bill 108 was the start. Bill 108 was that piece of legislation that basically was changing 16 pieces of legislation through one act. And initially, the Bill 108 was going to reduce the number of eligible services from where we were, which was, maybe 25, 30 municipal services. They were going to collapse it down to only 8. By the end of the period, there was a lot of dialogue. There was provincial committees set up with the development community, the municipal community. I was on that provincial committee. By the end of the day, it came out through Bill 197 that it was collapsed down to 20 different services, and I'll show you that. So we were able to recover 12 additional services, if you will, from what was originally discussed. What Bill 108 ended up, what they ended up leaving in was, for the most part, it was for cash flow to assist certain types of developments. So if you were a institutional development or rental housing, instead of paying at the time of building permit, you could pay upon occupancy, and then you'd pay over 5 years. You'd pay 1/6 on the day of occupancy, and then the next 5 years you would pay the charges. At the time, they also said for nonprofit housing, you could do it over 21 years. And then if you were had an application for site plan or for a zoning amendment, the day the municipality receives that as a valid application, it would freeze the development charges as of that date. And it would be frozen until 2 years after you as a council approved that application or that bylaw amendment. So they froze the charges. Now, with all of those, the province did allow for a level of indexing or inflation being added to it, or interest costs, however you want to coin it. They would allow some adjustments to it. And municipalities originally were allowed some opportunity to define what the interest rate was. Subsequently, the province through Bill 23 has come back in and define what the interest rate is. So you must use that interest rate. So at the end of the day, Bill 197 was the one where we saw the change in the eligible services, still reduced from what you had before, but not as significant as what the Bill 108 was going to provide. A positive, we used to do this mandatory 10% deduction on the softer services, so parks, recreation, library. They have removed that, so that allowed for a better cost recovery. And they also removed the mandatory 10-year planning horizon for those softer services. So not significant, but at the end of the day, that assisted. And then they introduced Bill 213 afterwards, which clarified or made it mandatory that universities were exempted. Bill 23, we've all heard about it. There's many different things in there. The most significant was the reductions in the development charge. They also significantly reduced your parkland dedication abilities. They basically cut it in half. And then they did allow for a community benefit charge. Now that was there before under the Planning Act, Section 37, which was basically called bonus zoning or nicknamed bonus zoning. They've changed the rules on that, and you can impose a charge of 4% of the land value if the development is going to be at least 5 stories and contain at least 10 houses, 10 units in it. So the community benefit charge broadened to allow more municipalities to take it into their revenue stream. They cut the parklands in half, and then, as we can see in a moment, they've reduced a lot of the recovery for your infrastructure costs. Now, what's been identified here is additional exemptions from what you had before. The exemptions weren't huge before. I mean, you couldn't build an administration building. You couldn't buy parkland with development charges. They left it to the Planning Act, but you could develop the parkland. So the amount of exemptions weren't excessive the last time, but as you can see, they've introduced a lot now. I'll start on the bottom because these are the ones that are in effect today. So you had inclusionary zoning. So if there's, higher density developments, you could require up to 5% of those units to be affordable housing. And if you do, all of those units that you designate would then be not have to pay the development charge. Nonprofit housing are completely exempt now from development charges. And if you had those installment payments that were started, they ceased on November 28th last year. So they've completely eliminated any charges for nonprofit housing. And then there was additional residential unit exemptions. They had made adjustments to do ancillary units, and then they've changed it again. Basically, now you can have up to 3 units of development. You're going to have like a single family home or townhouse or semi, and you can add 2 additional units and not have to pay the charge. So you're increasing the density, but you're not on that lot, but not being allowed to recover any more money. The top ones are in process right now. So they allow for affordable rental units, and basically the province is going to issue a bulletin. And they're going to tell, they'll have a set amount for Aurora. And if those amounts are the amount that they have is the average, if the housing application is less than 80% of that average value, those homes will be exempt. So if it's $1 million is the average home, if they're building at anything less than 800,000, all of those homes are exempted. So that's affordable owned unit. And they'll do a similar type of thing for an affordable rental unit where they'll define what the average rental is in the area. And if they're coming in at less than 80%, then they will be exempted as well. And they've introduced this new concept of an attainable unit, which isn't an affordable rental or affordable owned, but it's its own unique type of unit. But we don't know exactly what it is because they have to release regulations to give us that information. So at this particular point, we're not 100% sure what this means from an affordability perspective on your ability to recover money. Now, they will require you to enter into an agreement with those developments. And so that agreement, you'll be required to monitor for 25 years. And if they now become, they go from affordable, and if they exceed that 80%, then you're going to be able to charge them. Now, just to give you insights, I have no idea how this is going to operate. Number one, who are you entering into the agreement with? Is it the developer? Is it most of the time the people who pull the building permit is the builder, and then there's the homeowner. So we're not quite sure who we're going to enter into that agreement. And then it's monitoring the affordability, which becomes very difficult. If you have, let's say, an apartment complex, and you gave all of those apartments a discount, what if one of them is now selling at 81% of that number? Do you now come back and impose it on everybody? So there's a lot of challenges with this arrangement. Now, the province has engaged with municipalities. Once again, I'm engaged with the province to provide our comments. But right now, this is going to be a bit of a process. So the orange is not in place right now. We haven't got a bulletin. We haven't got definitions. So that's yet to come forward. Now, I would note that there was just released last week, there was another bill. I think it was Bill 131. And what they want to do is add a second criteria for affordable. And they're going to introduce an income aspect to it. So they're going to consider in theory, for each municipality, what the incomes are in some type of graded fashion. And if the average income is at the 60% quartile, if you're below that, that will translate into some calculation of an affordable rental unit, and in theory, an affordable housing unit, but we're not quite sure how that will, I don't know how that one's going to be calculated, but they've just introduced this legislation. Only a skeleton of words, not a lot of depth in the regulations. So the devil will be in the details, and that'll be yet to come. So there's even more coming forward, and I apologize for not being able to give you any more insights at this particular point. Further changes which are in place, rental housing discount. So even if it's not in a rental unit that gets exempted, if I have a regular, whatever regular is, apartment, if I have if I have 3 bedrooms or larger, then I will get a discount of 25% on the development charge. If it's a 2-bedroom, I'll get a 20% discount. And if it's a studio or a 1-bedroom, you'll get a 15% discount. So from the building plans, there'll be all these discounts that'll be applied. There's additional revenue reductions that come at the regional level. They were collecting to provide for their own municipal housing. That's been removed as of November 28th. Bang, it was an ineligible service. Across the province, which is predominantly GTA, but or Greater Golden Horseshoe, that removed about $2.2 billion and impacted about 42,000 housing units. 42,000 is 3% of the province's 10-year target for new housing. So they removed or constrain municipalities' ability to provide municipal housing. There's further cost amendments, capital cost adjustments. They've removed studies. So your official plans or secondary plans or master plans for water, wastewater, storms, parkland, they've now been removed. And they did say they're removing prescribed land from being an eligible capital cost. Right now, you can't collect for parkland. And they've said potentially that there's going to be further land that you can't buy through a development charge. Once again, we haven't got the regulations at this particular point, but the provision is there to remove some or all of the cost of the land. When we pass the bylaw, there will be a mandatory phase-in over 5 years. So that if we come in with a $10,000 charge, in the first year, you can only charge $8,000. The next year, $8,500. Next year, $9,000, $9,500. And only in the last, the fifth year, are you able to collect 100% of the charge. Now, that's a significant amount of revenue loss in just that particular adjustment. Part of the thing was they passed the legislation on November 28th, but they backdated it all the way to January 1st. So municipalities, some of the regional municipalities got caught having to all of a sudden lose those funds. The last one is, and I'll give you an example later, but this historic service level, it's a mathematical calculation we do. They originally had us go back 10 years and do that math calculation, which I'll explain shortly. And now they've gone back 15 years. Many of the studies we're seeing is that's reducing the amount of the charge because it's putting a cap. It's lowering the cap on how much we can recover for most of the services. It doesn't apply to water, wastewater, and storm, but every other service then it applies to. And I'll come back at that shortly. There is I talked about the interest rate on the on those cash flow matters, and the zoning and the site plan and zoning amendments. So now they've said that it will be the average prime rate plus 1%. So right now, because the interest rates are up, actually it's running at about 6.5–7%. But historically it was running very low at about 3%. So they'll require 60% of the money as part of the treasurer's statement. You'll need to identify for water, wastewater, and roads. Whatever money you have in the reserve at the end of the year, you need to identify how you're going to use 60% of those funds. It's not a big deal and doesn't mean you have to spend it. Doesn't mean that you have to open up projects. It just means that you have to have a statement. So I don't think that's significant. It's more transparency, more communication. And then the DC bylaws used to have a useful life of 5 years. They're now going out to 10 years. So that potentially you can get more years out of it without having to go through this process, but it's something that'll need to be monitored. For example, right now, 5 years have changed. The indexing that would have occurred, there you're able to index the charges, has gone up by about 39%. We're seeing the cost of projects go up between 50 and 100%, just because right now the cost of tenders and such is through the roof. So that's something which may encourage you to come back and revisit it earlier if the indexing isn't keeping pace with your actual tender prices. So I'll just leave that for the moment. That'll be something. Sure. When we go through this process, there will always be applications or development coming forward to council and saying, we need to not impose the charges or reduce the charges or whatever. But it's when we're looking at the development charges, it relates specifically to projects. It relates specifically to infrastructure. So that if there's any type of reductions or changes, what it means, it translates directly into a loss of revenue to fund those projects. So as we grow, we'll need to build additional infrastructure. It's not mandatory that you have development charges, but if you don't have development charges, that would place 100% of that cost burden onto the existing taxpayers. So it's a balancing item when you're considering any types of discretionary exemptions and such. There will be a cost of it, and that cost would translate into having to recover it from, well, either taxpayers or maybe you've got existing reserves, et cetera. So it's just a simple representation that there is a direct link between the charges and funding the project. Now, development charge, I'm going to just go through a very simple methodology, but the Development Charges Act is approximately 80 clauses and tons of subclauses. And when we take a look at it, there's in the range of about 175 case law right now. Considerable amount of legislation behind these charges. So there something that we always have to be mindful of as they change, how we do these calculations, because they can be affected from week to week. But the simple aspect of it is to identify the amount, the type, and location of growth. And once you know where the growth is occurring, that'll help you with identifying your servicing needs. Where do I need to expand roads? Where do I need to extend water main sewers or expand them? And from that servicing needs, it translates into capital costs. What's the dollar amount? There's a number of deductions we have to make, grant subsidies, other contributions, which these days is very limited. Excuse me. Benefit to existing development. So we always have to consider, are these projects enhancing to the, the services for the existing taxpayer, or is it solely looking at identifying the needs to accommodate the new taxpayer, the new growth? That's always a significant area of discussion between the development community and ourselves. The service standards, that calculation, which I'll touch on in a minute, sets an upper limit cap that we can't go past. It used to be based on 10 years. Now it's out to 15. A lot of the municipalities we're working with, we're seeing that adjustment in the cap lower the potential development charge recovery. We'll come back to you and express that as part of the study, what the impacts are when we get there. And then moving from one bylaw to the next, we have to rationalize the reserve fund balances, and that gets carried forward. It's mandatory that we look at those projects and allocate between residential growth and non-residential growth. If you don't want to charge non-residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, that's fine. You don't have to charge, but as part of the calculations, we still have to allocate some of the project costs to the non-residential side. Then we divide it by the growth to come up with the cost of the charge. Back to stalling out again. So basically, the fundamentals are look at the growth, identify needs arising for the growth, and move through and undertake the calculations. Now, I talked about the reduction in services as brought on by Bill 108. and through to 197. And the ones that we highlighted in blue are your services. So storm drainage is a service you provide, but normally you cover that as a local service. So the developers build whatever they need to accommodate their lands. So we don't have a charge for it, but we got water, wastewater. Services related to a highway is your roads, street lights, active transportation, turning lanes, intersections, all of that. Fire protection, library, parks, and rec. So parks and recreation have been combined. Many of the other services are for at the regional level. So they would have their own charges, do their own calculations. The service standards, very simply, it's a mathematical calculation that we do. Each department may have their own definition of level of service they want to provide. Like parks, you may want to provide 7 acres of land for every 1,000 people, or libraries, 0.6 square feet per capita, whatever. These are specific calculations that we do for the development charge. And I won't get into a lot of details, but what we need to do is look at quality and quantity measures. Quantity is normally, in this particular case, we've got public works facilities. So quantity is square footage of buildings. And quality is what's the cost per square foot to construct those buildings. So we start with what the construction cost is. We have manuals. We have a huge database. We also add the cost of land, the cost of contingencies, design, et cetera, and we come up with a cost. When we multiply those costs and the value per square foot, we end up getting a replacement cost. And I apologize, I know it's very small, but at the end of the day, we divide all of those costs by the population and come up with a cost per capita, which is really an investment that you've made for each resident within the community. Now, in this particular case, the calculations change from year to year, that per capita. We have to add them all together, divide by 15. And we come, if you take a look, and I apologize, in the very bottom left-hand corner, we end up with a dollar value per capita, an average over 15 years. And if we go back to this prior sheet, we then take that dollar amount, multiply it by the growth over, in this particular case, let's say 10 years, and that gives us an upper limit. So in this case, we get about 5.6 million for public works facilities. We can include projects up to $5.6 million. If your new facility is going to be $10 million, I can't include all of that cost in the calculation. And that's what that cap is doing, is suppressing the upper limit of what you can charge the developers. And as I say in this calculation, going from 10 years to 15 years, it's had, for most of the municipalities we've worked with so far, it's dampening that upper limit cap. So it's another area of potential reduction. We talked about capital costs. For the most part, capital costs can include anything that you need to construct that project. Can't do studies. So, but I would submit, if we've got to do an EA on a water or sewer or roads project, I would say that EA, even though they call it a study, it really is specific to the project. Without that approval, you can't get that project. I would submit that that's probably acceptable. Or if you call it a design study, that's still specific to the project. I think what they're eliminating is the master planning type of works, your planning related, your master planning type of projects for different services. So these are the list. Basically, anything you have to construct the project, you can include. We've highlighted the land because, as I noted, they are potentially removing certain types of land as they will prescribe from those calculations. Now, the last bullet I'll just jump down to, it talks about may include authorized costs incurred or proposed to be incurred. So sometimes most of the projects will include is a 10-year forecast or a longer term forecast. But there may be projects that you built 5 years ago and you're still paying debt. You issued debentures on them. We can pull those costs into the calculation. So that's the first half of it. We're either proposed or you may have already done it as long as we haven't paid off that liability. And that service can be provided by yourself or it could be provided by others. And I know that you have a relationship with Newmarket, let's say, for fire protection. So they may be providing something right at the border and the fire stations on their side, but it's still providing service to yourself. So you are allowed to go outside the boundaries or have somebody else provide it, and we can include the costs as part of the calculations. So that's okay. Well, we talked about capital costs that they've removed. As I say before, parkland acquisition wasn't allowed for. The vehicles and equipment had to be significant, so they had to last at least 7 years. And then there's, and that was to eliminate, things like people putting in hammers and screwdrivers and stuff like that. So the province made some type of determination on what's significant. And then computer equipments, for the most part, what was there in 1997 versus today, completely different. So we've gone through hearings to establish that if it's not integral to the provision of the service, you can't include it. But almost everything you do on water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, et cetera, are computer oriented. So it's not as much of a problem as it was in the past. And as we say, the studies have been removed and potentially land acquisition. When we go through, you'll see in the background study for a service, we'll identify all these different projects. In this example, we've got Public Works once again. So we'll identify individual projects over a planning horizon. We'll show the gross capital cost, and then each of those columns are what we must turn our minds to as part of the calculation. So there's define things that we must reduce the projects by. And we end up in the third to last column with a net amount that we must split between the residential and non-residential. And those numbers are basically what we use to calculate the charges. So in very simple terms, infrastructure cost divided by growth helps you define the charges. Now, residential is normally defined low, medium, high density. And so that will have a single and semi-detached townhouse type of charge, and then normally 3 different categories of apartments. Okay, so that is distinguishing basically the size, the number of bedrooms. Non-residential is expressed on a cost per square foot. So the building size is how you determine the charge. We talked about local service policies. I'm not going to go through too much detail, but what we're including there is how do we deal with local roads? So that could be internal to the subdivision. It could be on the adjacent to it. How do we deal with intersections? How do we deal with sidewalks, et cetera? Rural roads versus which may be being upgraded to urban. How do we deal with collectors, arterials? So that's normally a significant policy area. We can talk about intersections, street lights, bike routes, noise abatement, et cetera, and even water, wastewater, storm, and park requirements. This is a very key area that we must work with because there's been a number of hearings where municipalities where it may not have been as cleanly defined, and you find yourself at the board. So right now I've got, unfortunately, 3 complaints that I'm at the board dealing with, and they're testing the waters on local service definitions. So. And that local service policy, in very simple terms, what we're trying to do is there's a hierarchy of infrastructure. You start with a sewer, that's internal to the subdivision. It's right in front of the house. At some point, it goes into bigger pipes and goes into pumping stations. So at a certain level, we're going to draw a line, and below, that's the developer's costs. Above it, which may be larger trunks, larger pumping stations that are trying to get it to a sewage treatment plant, et cetera. That's what's in the blue. And in your particular case, the region has some of those responsibilities. So it would almost be like a three level type of policy because the local developers pay for a lot of the cost. You'll include a portion, and then the region includes a portion. Right now, as we've talked about, you can have your own exemptions. The mandatory ones we've already gone through, so I won't go back over them again. But the act does allow you as a council to, in addition, provide your own exemptions. You can reduce the charge in certain instances. You can eliminate it totally for certain types of developments. You can phase it in over time, but the province has given you a mandatory phase in now, so you'd have to consider that. And what is in there is a redevelopment credit. So if my house burns down, I should have a period of time that I can replace it and not have to pay a charge. So normally somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 years is the norm that municipalities work with. If you knocked it down and 20 years later, you want a redevelopment credit, they wouldn't get it. So currently, private schools, cemetery and burial grounds, places of worship, agricultural uses, and public hospitals are your discretionary exemptions. So we can revisit that as we go through the process. Your charges as of mid-year this year, you can see are laid out here. The largest charge is just under $36,000 for a single and semi-detached. Medium density is just below 27,000. Sorry. And then you've got apartments ranging from a small special care, more like the Chartwell type of apartment, running at about $11,000, and you've got the large apartments running at about $22,000. And then non-residential is about $68 per square meter. For those empirically inclined, it's about $6.25 per square foot. When we take a look at charges in and around the area, you can see the arrow denotes your current charge. The dark blue is the regional charge. Yours is the orange, and then the green is the school boards. You can see there's a couple in there that have hatched. And those are the phase-in for those municipalities. So Vaughan, you've got the full calculated rate, which is the highest one there. So their charge, all in with all the costs, is going to be in excess of $160,000 for a single detached unit. Their phase-in right now is just over $150,000. And then you can see next you've got Markham, who's in a similar stage, and we've included Mississauga because they're another large municipality, and we've included Toronto. So you can see you're on the the right side of center with respect to the amount of the charge. On non-residential, you can see it's similar. This is retail charges. Once again, you're to right of the center. Largest component of the charges is at the regional level. The local level is much smaller. And if we take a look at industrial, non-retail, if you will, then you can see the charges are much smaller. So for more of the industrial type of units, you're at about $30 per square. I think this is on a per square foot basis. So we're updating the capital plan right now. That'll be the basis for the calculation. So obviously we'll be looking at your 10-year capital budget, taking a look at the master plans, and identifying the needs. Now, there will be more master plans going out to embrace the province's new targets. We don't have all of the infrastructure which is identified to accommodate the provincial targets. So we're going a little bit less, which is okay, but we're trying to match the infrastructure to the population. So instead of, the province may have set a 10-year target, we'll have a lower number. So maybe we have a 7-year growth forecast compared to the region. But if we use their numbers, but we don't have the infrastructure, we have the dollars, and if we have too big a denominator, your development charge is going to go down because we haven't populated enough of the projects. So that'll come into play later on. We'll have to revisit this into the future. And you're not a lot different than a lot of municipalities who haven't been able to complete all of their master plans to accommodate those new numbers. And then just to recap, as I say, we'll be back to you in late 23, early 24 with the updated calculations, and with your indulgence, we'll start that public process. And hopefully by in Q1, we'll have the adoption of the new DC bylaw. I think that is the end. Back.
Thank you. Councillor, you pass the chair back. Thank you. I passed it to him when well, he didn't say, I just wanted to make sure. Okay. Questions, Councillor Gallo, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. It's thorough. Just one question and then kind of a financial question or a go forward question. There was on page 9 of 35, the changes to the DCA and the exemptions, the ones that are currently in force. The last one there, additional residential unit exemptions. It speaks to second and third units in new single, semis, and town houses. I'm just later on in the presentation, I think it's page 26 under exemptions, under mandatory exemptions. It adds in an auxiliary structures. Are those two different things that we're talking about?
Gary, go ahead.
So, sorry, what was the second page reference?
26 of 35. Exemptions, mandatory exemptions.
Yep. There we go. So ancillary is the term. That's ancillary is meant to be ancillary means related to the primary purpose. So if we have a single family home, if you have a detached garage, you can add, that would be ancillary to put a an apartment up there. Or in Toronto, they're putting in laneway housing, so kind of a garage and stuff like that. That's what ancillary is. It's it is subordinate to the primary use. The other units would be if I come and take a building permit for a single family, I can add apartment in the basement, not have to pay for the apartment. So those are the two types of units that they're eliminating. Is you can get up to 3 or 2 additional units if it's ancillary or it's basically like an apartment inside a single, semi, or a townhouse.
Councillor.
Okay, I was just wondering whether on page 9 it spoke to the exemptions. It didn't add ancillary there, but it did on page 25.
Gary?
So the additional unit is the
Additional residential
so
unit.
yes, we used additional unit, which is the 2 different types. Ancillary is one of the 2 different types.
Okay.
So it would be subordinate. But as I say, the ancillary is meaning if you've got a pool.
No, I understand the
okay.
definition. I was just
Okay.
the 2. I didn't see ancillary in the first on page 9.
That's fine. It's included.
The only other thing is at some point we have to get to, what is the financial impact to the municipality?
Yes.
Obviously, it's not here. It's not part of this report. And I guess the question is, it's not here because we're just not there yet and it's coming. Is it as a result of we don't have the full picture because some of the regulations are still missing. Although some municipalities seem to have gotten some numbers on paper, even if it's from this range to this range of an impact. At what point do we expect through you, Mr. Mayor, to see that?
Carrie?
Mr. Mayor. Some of the other ones like Markham and Vaughan and Richmond Hill are ahead of you. Markham and Vaughan have passed their bylaws. Richmond Hill is closing in on, in fact, I think next week I'm presenting to Richmond Hill Council on the preliminary charges. So we've got the information. We're just, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks, and we can come back to you and give you those impacts.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Mayor, once we have that at the end of the year, how much time do we have to either implement bylaw or implement a strategy to be able to deal with that?
Carrie?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm assuming that part of the process will be the treasurer trying to address that through the capital budget process. You won't have 100% of the revenues that you may have planned on. And so as we go through with staff, putting all of that together, we'll be assisting in the calculations and the dialogue with the finance department.
Council?
Are we to ask questions of staff, or was that once the
Okay,
president? So through you, Mr. Mayor, to staff, do we have a sense of when we'll know those numbers and how much time we have to address them in a meaningful way?
Ms. Wainwright Van Kessel?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So one of the key pieces, our bylaw, the current one expires in the end of March next year. So we have to have the new bylaw ready so we can continue to collect development charges by then. The other piece, it will impact the way we forecast our development charges going forward. So that does get factored into the 10-year capital plan, and it affects the amount of growth projects we can do. We've already seen like delayed growth and things like that impacting some of our growth projects that we have in our plan now, and seeing some of those larger infrastructure projects being very difficult to build because we aren't able to collect the DCs that we could in the past. So it's something that is looked at on an annual basis. One of the key things that we're waiting for is those pieces that we don't know yet, and what is affordable and what is attainable, and how is the province going to define that, particularly in a community like Aurora, where our average house price could actually be quite high.
Council?
And I realize there's lots of moving parts and there's nothing definite about this, but I am, and I'm sure everyone else is, worried that the impact of this is going to end up on the tax base. And if that's the case, it needs to be planned. It can't even be for 2025, budget. We have to, I'd like to know, and I'm sure everyone else would like to know, what is that plan? And how are we going to address it quickly?
We will be doing those calculations in conjunction with finance, and that will be feeding into the capital budget process. So those losses are going to have to be factored into the calculations for the capital budget and the impacts on the operating budget.
Thank you.
Councilor Skyline?
Thank you. Through Mr. Mayor to the presenter. You had said something to the fact that we have to allocate 60% of our reserves. And I'm just curious as to what does that mean when you say you had to have a general statement as where you're putting it, like what if something changes? It just concerning to me that, we're trying to predict the future of something that hasn't happened.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a good question. It's not that you have to create the projects and transfer the money. You have a 10-year capital in the development charge study. We have all of those projects, and generally we have staff's best vision of when they'll be constructed, and that finds themselves into the capital budget. So actually, it's quite an easy task for water, wastewater, and storm, because here's the amount of money I have, and that's probably will be consumed by the 2024-2025 capital budget projects. So that's why I say it's to myself, it's not a significant event. I think what it is for more transparency and expressing, here's how we, at this point through the capital budget process, anticipate using those funds. And as I say, just transparency. It's not an issue I would believe to be concerned with. You have staff.
Counselor?
Thank you. Well, we do have very capable staff that's is giving us a 10-year outlook. So I think we pretty much established a lot of that already. So thanks.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming this evening. Counselor, I get a motion to adjourn. Counselor Thompson, Counselor Gilliland, all those in favor? Opposed? Carries. We are adjourned. Thank you.